If you ever get the impression that nothing unusual happens on West 35th Street before 11 o'clock, you haven't met the people who make a habit of being exceptions. Tuesday mornings are sacred at the Brownstone, orchid hours from 9 to 11, and even the city knows better than to intrude. But the city doesn't brief every young woman who decides to ring our bell at 10:52 with a leather portfolio under her arm, and a look that says she's already decided what we're going to decide. I was at my desk in the office, logging expenses from the previous week that would keep our bank account from turning as thin as a cheap suit. Fritz had dropped a plate with 3 cheese straws within easy reach, a vote of confidence in my blood sugar. The bell rang with intention. Some people push buttons, others push them with purpose. I wiped the butter from my mouth and went to the hall. Enter Iris Channing. She was 5'7" with her shoulders back, which she kept that way, and her ordinary brown hair worked for her because she kept it under control. In a city full of women who apply war paint like they expect photographers at every corner, she had done her face neatly and left it at that. She held the portfolio with both hands like it might bolt. "Good morning," she said, her voice careful and measured. "Mr. Wolfe. The large sedentary man you've heard about is upstairs with his plants," I told her. "He sees no one until 11, and at 11 he sees them from his chair. I'm his right arm, sometimes his legs, and always his secretary, Archie Goodwin. If your business can be announced and legally sterilized, I can do it." She considered me with the look of someone who needs an invitation to be refused rather than welcomed. "I can wait 8 minutes. My watch said 7. "Come in anyway," I said, opening the door wider. "You'll make me look like a man who can accelerate time." The office. Introduction. She followed me to the office, taking in the big desk that had seen more trouble than a judge's bench, the red leather chair that had accommodated more bulk than chairs were designed for, and the other chairs for paying customers and those who might become them, the globe, the books, the filing cabinets, and the rug that had cost me a second look when Fritz first unrolled it. She took the paying customer chair like she had measured it from the door. "You can tell me your name," I prompted. "It will save me calling you Miss Portfolio when I introduce you in precisely 6 minutes." She adjusted the portfolio on her lap. "Iris Channing." The name didn't ring any bells, but sometimes bells wait for you to pull the cord. "Miss Channing, in what capacity?" "In the capacity of walking something across town that shouldn't have gone through the mail." "Messages or money?" I said. "Money gets more respect at this address." "Not money." Her mouth tilted slightly. "Something both less and more." "The posthumous commission. I've had people try to be mysterious to impress me, and it usually makes me want to hand them a coupon for free clarity." But there was a quality in her voice that meant she wasn't reaching for effect. She was holding her nerves with both hands and doing a competent job of it. "I'm here at the instruction of a man who died last night," she said. "He told me to bring this here if he did." There's a way to say something like that as a footnote, and a way to say it so the words sit in the room and make themselves comfortable. She had chosen the second approach, and the room obliged. "His name," I said. "Clive Thorne." This time a small bell dinged in the back of my head. Thorne had appeared in the papers more than once without being in a box with handles. Money, yes, and the kind that had opinions it thought deserved to be quoted. "The thing about dead men," I told her, "is they sometimes leave instructions that make the living work too hard. How did Mr. Thorne give you this job? And why you?" "The legal connection. I'm an associate at Harrow and Baird," she said. "His old firm. Not his primary counsel anymore, but he trusted me. He gave me an envelope 3 weeks ago with a letter to me and something for Mr. Wolfe. He called it insurance he hoped never to cash. He said if anything appeared to be an accident or suicide, not to accept it, and if it was murder, to bring this here myself." My eyebrows performed a small exercise on their own. "And he's dead." She nodded. "Fell 4 floors inside the stairwell at the Verbank building. The police are..." She made a gesture that could have meant anything from competent to not on my schedule. It was after hours, but there were people there. A reception on the 12th floor. He made a toast and left early. He was found an hour later. "And you have something he meant for Mr. Wolfe," I said. "If you tell me it's a picture of his wife, I'll be disappointed." The mysterious package. She opened the portfolio and produced an envelope addressed in careful black ink to Nero Wolfe. It had never seen any mail. No stamp, no postmark. The flap had been sealed with wax and broken. "I opened the outer letter," she said without defensiveness. "It told me nothing except to bring this one here and to tell you he trusted your judgment more than any man he had met in a decade, which is either flattery or a comment about the decade. The inner envelope was sealed with string and wafer. I didn't open it. I am not as curious as you are." "Few are," I said, picking up the envelope. The paper had substance you could feel. I set it down again because habit matters around here. Wolfe's entrance. The front door closed downstairs, and I could hear his measured gait in the hall, like a battleship finding its berth. The clock said 11. Fritz would call it cooperative fate. I call it decent timing. He entered and settled into the red leather chair like a man who had put it through college and expected it to support his retirement. He wore yellow house slippers and a brown suit that impressed you only when you saw how it behaved when he sat. His thumb and forefinger found their familiar position on his belly, and he aimed his gaze at me. "Archie," he said, "you're about to either divert me or annoy me. That woman will accomplish one of those things as well." The button revealed. "Miss Iris Channing," I said. "She has a hand-delivered envelope from the late Clive Thorne that he insisted you should have. She's not getting paid by the minute, but she should be." He extended a finger, and I placed the envelope in his hand. He studied it for 8 seconds, time enough for him to decide whether something is clever or merely pretentious, then snapped the flap and tipped it. What slid onto the blotter made neither a thud nor a whisper. It was a button, the ordinary kind you pass every day without naming. Dark, glossy, with a faint burr at one edge. 4 holes, not plain, not showy. It sat there like a student on the teacher's desk, waiting to learn what word it had mispronounced. I looked at Miss Channing. She regarded the button like someone who had already used up their quota of surprises for the week. Wolfe didn't touch it immediately. He leaned forward to examine it closely, which for him isn't far, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The letter's contents. "He also wrote something," Miss Channing said quickly. "In the letter to me." Wolfe's eyes opened. "Did he?" She produced a folded sheet of paper, smoothed with care. "He said, 'If I am dead and it is not accident or despair, take the enclosed to Wolfe. He will know whether it belonged on me, and if it did not, he will know to whom it does.'" She paused. "That's all." Wolfe's initial assessment. Wolfe took the paper, weighed it with a glance, then lifted the button between thumb and forefinger, holding it to the light. He turned it twice with the economy of movement that never fumbles and never lets you think you could take anything from him. He set it down. "Miss Channing, whom did Mr. Thorne name as his murderer?" She blinked. "He didn't. Of course he didn't," Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. "He sent me a button." The investigation begins. I waited for elaboration. None came. "The newspapers," I offered, "haven't called it anything yet." "They won't in their first editions," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "Not until Inspector Kramer has had time to bite whatever is within reach. Miss Channing, where's the coat this button belongs to?" She looked between me and him. "I don't know that it belonged to any coat. Mr. Thorne kept it in his safe." Wolfe's eyes opened. "His safe? At his office?" "No. At his apartment." She shook her head. "He showed it to me. He showed me the envelope and said, 'This is for a man whom I have never paid. If I have to, I will. And did he? No. He promised to call Mr. Wolfe last week, then said he didn't need to yet. The buttons. Significance. Wolfe made a sound like air escaping from a tire. Archie. Yes, sir. Describe it. I examined the button carefully. 4-hole, dark, horn, not plastic, not shell. The finish is good, only slightly dull at one edge, like it encountered stone or floor. The underside is smooth. The holes are clean and beveled. The rim won't snag. No maker's stamp visible unless you want me to pry, which you don't on a Tuesday before lunch. He gave me a look that could peel paint. You have handled moderate reality adequately. Now try precision. Yes, sir. It has a tiny crescent notch on the rim at 9 o'clock. The polish line is tighter at 2 o'clock, as if it was turned slightly too long. The color is nearly black, but holds warmth in light. That suggests horn, possibly water buffalo, good grade. If it's custom, it likely came from a tailor whose clients expected something under their fingers worth as much as the cloth on their backs. The suspects emerge. Miss Channing's expression suggested relief that we were treating her dead man's token as important, mixed with irritation that we were doing it without explanation. Wolfe nodded once. Miss Channing, why did he show it to you? Because I was the one who made him say the word murder out loud, she said evenly. He had been receiving threats. Notes. One mentioned a missing button as proof that someone had been where they shouldn't have been. He told me that was nonsense, that he mislaid small things like every man. Then he took this out and said, "Accept this. I mislaid this once and found it where it should not have been." He called it a token. If something happened to him, it would mean something. Who else knew you had it to bring? I asked. No one. I told my managing partner I had an appointment regarding a client's estate. That's true enough. Who else saw it in his hands? She drew breath, then released it. No one I know of. The circle of suspects. Miss Channing, Wolfe said, your knowledge of Mr. Thorne's associates may be limited, but you knew his concerns. Whom did he fear? He denied the word fear. She looked between us. There were 3 pressures. His ex-wife, Leda, had filed to reopen part of their settlement. A partner in his new venture, Garrick Lane, had been pushing to acquire a company Mr. Thorne considered unclean. And a foundation director, Dr. Miriam Pell, had informed him that his pledge was overdue, and she couldn't maintain one of their programs without it. He said all 3 were capable of making noise. He didn't say any would push him down a stairwell. Wolfe takes the case. Then you have done adequately? Wolfe said. Archie. Yes. Call Mr. Kramer. Tell him I will not insult him by pretending ignorance about Clive Thorne's name or the fact that I possess an object he will eventually request. Invite him to perform his duty when he has digested his cigar, not before. That will ease his breakfast, I said. What else? Nothing else. Miss Channing sat straighter. Mr. Wolfe, He raised a finger. Please. You brought what he intended. You have discharged your obligation to a dead man. Now discharge the one you owe the living. Does his estate retain me? I'm not his executor, but I can arrange a retainer. You can recommend it. You cannot arrange it. What you can do is obtain for me a list of those attending last evening's reception, those who remained afterward, and those who left when Mr. Thorne left. You can obtain details of his ex-wife's petition and the terms of his pledge to Dr. Pell's foundation. You can also provide the addresses and telephone numbers of Leda Thorne, Garrick Lane, and Dr. Pell. And you will refrain from telling anyone you have been here. The inconvenience to me of premature rumors outweighs any advantage to you of being first with news. She studied him, and for a moment I wondered if she would tell him he was exactly as advertised, and that she resented his accuracy. Instead, she nodded. I can have all of that by this afternoon. By 2 o'clock, he said. Between then and 4, I'm engaged. Dr. Archer's hybrids will not tolerate solitude. The setup. Complete. When she stood, she seemed lighter than when she had sat. A common occurrence here. People arrive carrying invisible weight and leave a pound lighter. She gathered her portfolio, glanced at the button as if memorizing it for future nightmares, then looked at me. "You'll call if we decide to do something inadvisable." I smiled. "We rarely warn anyone in advance when we do something inadvisable. But if we accept you as a conduit for funds, you'll hear first." In the hall, she asked, "Is he as immovable as they say?" "More," I told her. "But if you bring him something he can grip with his teeth, he'll worry it until sometimes the thing confesses." "What kind of button do you think you just brought him?" She considered that, the kind from a coat that costs too much. "There's no such thing," I said, and opened the door for her. The challenge accepted. When I returned, he hadn't moved. The button remained on the blotter, the light having shifted to turn it the color of old coffee. "Well," I said, "we have a dead man, a button, and a woman who'd prefer not to be noticed delivering one to us. It feels like Tuesday." He made a sound like a patient sigh. "Archie, do not be obtuse. Buttons are manufactured by machines and refined by men who believe a man's second skin should flatter him more than his first. This is horn, as you observed, and not the variety sold by the gross in tins. It belonged to a suit made by one of 5 men in this city. One of those men will have sold extra dozens when his customer requested replacements for his drawer. One will have ordered only enough to match scarce cloth. One will lie. We will determine which." "You're going to be knee-deep in tailors," I said. "Not if I can help it," he said, looking pained. "They talk. They also hold grudges, and grudges sew excellent buttonholes." "Call Mr. Kramer," he said, settling back with the air of a man who had accepted an inevitable burden. As I reached for the phone, I reflected that we had just committed ourselves to unraveling a mystery that began with a dead man's foresight and a button that had wandered where it shouldn't have been. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such beginnings rarely led to simple endings. The game, as they say, was afoot, even if the foot in question belonged to a man who preferred never to leave his chair. Calling Inspector Kramer is like poking a hibernating bear with a stick made of red tape. You know exactly what's going to happen, but sometimes it's necessary anyway. I reached him at his desk, where he was probably contemplating the various ways Tuesday had disappointed him. "Inspector," I said after navigating past a sergeant who sounded like he gargled with gravel, "Archie Goodwin here. Wolfe wanted me to inform you that he is in possession of an item related to the demise of Clive Thorne. He thought it only fair to spare you the indignity of discovering it through less direct channels." The silence that followed had weight to it, like the pause before thunder. "Goodwin, what in hell are you talking about? Thorne's death is being investigated as an accidental fall. What item and what business does Wolfe have with it?" "It's a button, Inspector, a rather specific button. Mr. Thorne, in his infinite foresight, arranged for it to be delivered to Wolfe in the event of his death, with the clear implication that his death might not be accidental." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Kramer's head. "A button? You're telling me a dead man sent Nero Wolfe a button as a posthumous murder clue?" "That's the essence of it. Wolfe suggested you might want to stop by when you've finished digesting whatever's making you sound dyspeptic. He'll be in the office." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Goodwin. And if this is another one of Wolfe's theatrical productions, I'll personally see that button gets filed where theatrical productions belong." The line went dead with emphasis. The storm arrives. Kramer arrived in exactly 19 minutes, which for him qualified as restraint. He came through the front door like a man who had been personally insulted by the concept of Tuesday and intended to demand satisfaction from Wednesday. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins followed in his wake, looking like he'd rather be directing traffic in a hailstorm. I led them to the office, where Wolfe sat examining the button with his magnifying glass, the way a jeweler might study a diamond he suspected of being glass. The button rested on the green blotter, small and dark and somehow managing to look both innocent and ominous. "All right, Wolfe," Kramer said, settling into the red leather chair without invitation. "What's this about a button?" Wolfe set down his glass and regarded the inspector with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a bright child. "It is about evidence, Inspector. Evidence delivered to me this morning by Miss Iris Channing, an attorney, at the posthumous instruction of Clive Thorne. The button's testimony." Kramer leaned forward to examine the button without touching it. His expression suggested a man trying to read significance into tea leaves. "And you think this proves murder?" "I think Mr. Thorne thought it might. He described it as insurance he hoped never to cash. He also indicated that whether it belonged on him or not would determine its meaning." Wolfe's fingers found their familiar position on his belly. "My task is to determine its proper provenance." "Provenance," Kramer repeated, like the word had left a bad taste. "It's a button, Wolfe, 4 holes and some polish." "Inspector, this button was fashioned from water buffalo horn by someone who understood that a man's clothing should reward daily handling. The beveled holes, the hand-finished rim, the quality of the material, this came from a garment that cost more than most men earn in a month. It was not mass-produced, and it was not carelessly made." Pearlie Stebbins had produced a small camera and was photographing the button from various angles, like a tourist documenting a monument. "So it's expensive," he said. "Rich guy, expensive button. Where's the mystery?" The crime scene revelation. "The mystery," Wolfe said, "lies in the fact that Mr. Thorne's clothing last night contained no such buttons. Inspector, perhaps you would share what you discovered at the Verbank building." Kramer consulted his notebook with the air of a man reading his own obituary. "Thorne went over the 4th floor railing at approximately 9:40 last night. He'd been at a reception on the 12th floor. Some charity foundation affair. Left early, said he wasn't feeling well. Building security found him an hour later." "The stairwell," Wolfe prompted. "Emergency exit. Well maintained, but not heavily used. The elevators work fine, and most people don't climb 12 floors for exercise. Security cameras cover the lobby and elevator banks, but not the stairwells. Budget cuts." "How convenient," I observed. "Or irrelevant," Kramer said. "Sometimes a man just falls downstairs, Wolfe." "Sometimes," Wolfe agreed, "but rarely after arranging for evidence to be delivered to me posthumously. Who else left the reception when Mr. Thorne did?" The circle of interest. Kramer flipped pages with the enthusiasm of a man reading tax forms. 3 people left within 10 minutes of each other. Thorne's ex-wife, Leda, she's on the foundation board, a business partner named Garrick Lane, and the foundation director, Dr. Miriam Pell, who said she had another appointment. The names hung in the air like smoke from Kramer's unlit cigar. Miss Channing's list of Thorne's 3 pressures had just become a list of 3 people who left the building around the time he took his final walk. "Tell me about these 3, Wolfe said. "Lady Thorne divorced him 2 years ago. She's trying to reopen part of their settlement. Claims he hid assets during the proceedings. Garrick Lane is his business partner in some investment firm. They were putting together a deal to acquire a manufacturing company. Lane wanted to move fast. Thorne wanted more due diligence. Dr. Miriam Pell runs the Meridian Foundation. They fund educational programs. Thorne pledged $500,000 last year, but was 3 months behind on payments." The pattern emerges. 3 pressures, I said. 3 people with 3 different reasons to want Thorne to change his mind about 3 different things. "And all 3 happened to leave at the same time he died," Wolfe added. "Inspector, does this constellation of coincidence not strain your acceptance?" Kramer removed his cigar, examined it like it might contain answers, then put it back unlit. "What strains my acceptance is the idea that 3 people conspired to push a man downstairs based on a button that might mean nothing." "The button means something," Wolfe said with finality. "The question is what, and to whom?" The evidence dilemma. Kramer stood and walked to the window, looking out at West 35th Street like it might offer simpler problems to solve. "All right," he said finally. "I want that button examined by the lab, and I'll take another look at the 3 people who left early." "You may examine it here," Wolfe said. "You may not remove it." "Chain of custody, Wolfe. If this becomes evidence in a murder case, you will know where to find it. Until then, it remains where Mr. Thorne intended it to be." Kramer's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. He knew Wolfe well enough to recognize an immovable position when he encountered one. "Fine, but I want a full report on anything you discover. And Wolfe, if this turns into one of your elaborate theories about human nature and moral philosophy, I'm going to be very unhappy." "Inspector," Wolfe said, "I have never yet constructed a theory to make you happy." The investigation expands. After Kramer and Stebbins departed, leaving behind the faint scent of frustration and unlit tobacco, I turned to Wolfe. "So we have 3 suspects, 3 motives, and 1 button that's causing more trouble than a cat in a canary shop." "We have the beginning of understanding," he corrected. The button was Mr. Thorne's way of pointing us towards someone whose clothing he had encountered intimately enough to remove this token. Someone who had been where they should not have been, doing what they should not have done. "And our next step?" Wolfe closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. "We wait for Miss Channing to return with the details that will allow us to separate the wheat from the chaff, and we prepare to receive visitors who will, I suspect, be most eager to discuss Mr. Thorne's unfortunate accident." The afternoon stretched ahead of us, pregnant with possibilities and the promise that our quiet brownstone was about to become considerably less quiet. The button sat on the blotter like a small, dark challenge, waiting to reveal the secrets it had been keeping since the moment Clive Thorne decided that his death might not be as natural as it appeared. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such beginnings rarely led to peaceful conclusions. Miss Channing returned at 2:00 with the punctuality of someone who understood that Nero Wolfe's schedule was not a suggestion. She carried a manila envelope thick enough to contain either comprehensive answers or comprehensive problems. In my experience, the two are often indistinguishable. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 2:04, settled into his chair with the deliberation of a judge taking the bench, and extended one finger toward the envelope. I placed it in his hand, and he examined the contents with the care of a man who had learned that information, like orchids, required proper handling to flourish. "Satisfactory," he pronounced after scanning the documents. "Archie, familiarize yourself with these details while I consider their implications." The papers told a story of 3 pressures applied to one man, each from a different angle, each with its own sharp edge. Later Thorne's petition detailed allegations of hidden offshore accounts totaling $2 million, money she claimed her ex-husband had concealed during their divorce proceedings. The Meridian Foundation's records showed Clive Thorne's pledge of $500,000, with quarterly payments now 3 months overdue. The partnership documents between Thorne and Garrick Lane revealed a fundamental disagreement over the acquisition of consolidated manufacturing, with environmental liabilities that could cost millions. The reception guest list confirmed what we already suspected. All 3 had departed the Verbank building within 12 minutes of Thorne's exit, each citing different reasons for their early departure. The first visitor, Garrick Lane. At 3:15, the front doorbell announced itself with the confidence of someone accustomed to immediate attention. I opened the door to find a man who looked like he had been assembled from premium components, expensive suit, manicured hands, and the kind of smile that had been trained to close deals and intimidate competitors. "Garrick Lane," he said, extending a business card. "I believe you've been expecting me." "Mr. Wolfe expects many things," I replied. "Most of them involve other people being more forthcoming than they initially intend. Come in." Lane entered the office with the energy of a man who viewed every room as a potential boardroom. He took the red leather chair without invitation and regarded Wolfe with the calculating look of someone pricing real estate. "I understand," Lane began, "that Clive left you something before his unfortunate accident. I'm here to discuss how that might affect our business relationship." Wolfe's eyes opened to half-mast. "Mr. Lane, I have no business relationship with you. Mr. Thorne, however, appears to have anticipated that his death might not be accidental." "That's absurd," Lane said, his smile faltering slightly. "Clive was paranoid. He saw conspiracies in quarterly reports. The man fell downstairs because he'd had too much to drink and was distracted by his legal troubles." "Tell me about consolidated manufacturing," Wolfe said. Lane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A solid acquisition target, undervalued assets, good market position. Clive was being overly cautious about some minor environmental issues. "Minor?" I asked. "According to these documents, the cleanup costs could reach $6 million. "Manageable," Lane said curtly, "in the context of the total deal value." Clive lacked vision. He was letting perfect be the enemy of profitable. Wolfe studied Lane's coat with the attention of a jeweler examining a suspect diamond. "Your buttons are horn, Mr. Lane, but not from the same source as this one." He gestured toward the button on his blotter. Lane glanced down at his coat, then back at Wolfe. "I don't shop at one tailor exclusively. Diversification is good business practice." "Indeed," Wolfe said dryly. "You may go, Mr. Lane. I will contact you if I require further illumination of your business practices." Lane stood, his composure restored, but his eyes harder than when he'd arrived. "Mr. Wolfe, I hope you won't let Clive's paranoia interfere with a legitimate police investigation." "I hope," Wolfe replied, "that you won't let your business interests interfere with the truth." The second visitor, Dr. Miriam Pell. Dr. Pell arrived 20 minutes later, bringing with her the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing both budgets and human expectations. She was dressed simply, but well, her silver hair pulled back in a style that suggested competence rather than vanity. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, taking the chair Lane had vacated, "I came because I believe you should understand what Clive meant to our organization." "Dr. Pell, I'm more interested in what your organization meant to Mr. Thorne. Specifically, the pressure created by his overdue pledge." She folded her hands in her lap with the precision of someone who had learned to control external displays of internal tension. "We were concerned, yes. The literacy program serves 300 children. Without Clive's support, we would have to cut services significantly." "Did you press him for payment?" I reminded him of his commitment. I showed him photographs of the children who would be affected. I may have been more direct than usual in our final conversation. "When was that?" "Last week." He seemed distracted, troubled by something beyond our financial discussions. He mentioned that he was dealing with people who wanted things from him that he couldn't give. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "Did he specify these people?" His ex-wife's legal actions were clearly weighing on him, and he expressed frustration with his business partner's aggressive approach to their acquisition plans. He said Mr. Lane was willing to cut corners that shouldn't be cut. I made a note. "Dr. Pell, did you leave the reception at the same time as Mr. Thorne?" "I left shortly after he did. I had another appointment, a potential donor who could only meet late in the evening. I used the elevator, like any civilized person would." The dramatic revelation. Leader Thorne. At 4:30, the doorbell rang with a different quality. Not the aggressive demand of a businessman or the measured approach of an academic, but the sharp insistence of someone who had run out of patience with the world's inefficiencies. Lady Thorne swept into the office like a storm system that had been building pressure for hours. She was elegantly dressed in black, her silver-touched hair perfectly arranged, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was armor. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the chair without invitation, "I believe we need to discuss my ex-husband's paranoid delusions." "Mrs. Thorne," Wolfe replied. I prefer to discuss facts, beginning with your knowledge of the button Mr. Thorne sent to me." Her composure flickered for just a moment. "So he actually did it. He threatened to send you something if anything happened to him. I told him he was being melodramatic. You knew about this arrangement?" She opened her purse and produced a small digital camera. 3 weeks ago, Clive accused me of hiring someone to search his apartment. He showed me this button, claimed he'd found it on his bedroom floor after returning from a business trip. Said it proved someone had been through his belongings. She held the camera's display toward us. The image showed the same button, photographed against what appeared to be a dark wooden surface. The same 4 holes, the same slight notch at the rim, the same quality and finish. "And had you hired someone?" I asked. "Mr. Goodwin, if I wanted to search Clive's apartment, I would have done it myself during our marriage, when I had keys and legal access. I hire attorneys and accountants, not burglars." Wolfe studied the photograph with interest. "Mrs. Thorne, whose clothing did this button belong to?" She smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. "That information will cost you a consultation fee, Mr. Wolfe. I'll expect your call within 24 hours. She stood and smoothed her coat with the precision of someone who used small gestures to maintain control. "One more thing. You might want to investigate who at Harrow and Baird was asking about environmental liability insurance 3 weeks ago. Some questions answer themselves if you know where to look." The tailor's thread. After Leda Thorne departed, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and veiled threats, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. "Archie," he said finally, "call Sarti Emiliani. Tell him I require his expertise in matters of provenance and craftsmanship. Do not mention buttons specifically, simply that I need to consult with someone who understands the relationship between cloth and the men who wear it." The tailor Miss Channing mentioned. "Indeed. If this button came from a garment made by one of the city's premier tailors, Emiliani will know it. He will also know which of his clients might have been careless enough to lose such a token in another man's bedroom." I reached for the phone, then paused. "And if Mrs. Thorne is telling the truth about knowing whose button it is, then we will discover whether the price of her information is worth paying. But first, we will exhaust the avenues that do not require negotiating with blackmailers." The circle drawn. The afternoon had brought us 3 suspects, each with motive and opportunity, each with secrets they preferred to keep buried. Leda Thorne wanted money and claimed knowledge she was willing to sell. Garrick Lane wanted a business deal that his partner's death would simplify. Dr. Miriam Pell needed funds that only Thorne's continued generosity could provide. But now we had something more. Confirmation that someone had indeed searched Thorne's apartment 2 weeks before his death, and that the button had been left behind as evidence of that intrusion. The question remained, whose button was it, and what had they been looking for? The brownstone had been thoroughly disturbed by the parade of visitors, each bringing their own version of the truth, each leaving with the uncomfortable knowledge that Nero Wolfe was not easily satisfied with surface explanations. As I prepared to call the tailor, I reflected that we were no longer simply investigating a suspicious death. We were unraveling a web of deception that had been building for weeks, with threads that connected hidden assets, environmental cover-ups, and desperate financial needs. The button sat on Wolfe's blotter like a small, dark key, waiting to unlock secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. When Nero Wolfe requires specialized knowledge, he doesn't send messengers, he summons oracles. At 9:30 Wednesday morning, I called Emiliani Sarti at his Madison Avenue establishment, where he transforms mere cloth into statements of intent and charges accordingly. "Mr. Sarti," I said after the usual pleasantries, "Mr. Wolfe requires your expertise regarding the provenance of a particular button. He believes it to be of exceptional quality and hopes you might illuminate its origins." The pause that followed had the weight of professional consideration. "Mr. Goodwin, buttons of exceptional quality are not discussed over telephone lines like stock quotations. If Mr. Wolfe possesses such an item, I We'll examine it properly. I can be at your establishment within the hour." "Mr. Wolfe would be grateful," I said, knowing that Wolfe's gratitude often translated into Fritz's most impressive culinary efforts. The master's assessment. Sarti arrived at 10:15, carrying a small leather case that contained the tools of his trade: loops, calipers, and measuring devices that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit. He was a compact man with silver hair and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades coaxing perfection from stubborn materials. Wolfe received him in the office with a courtesy reserved for fellow craftsmen. After Fritz had served coffee in the good cups, Sarti opened his case and approached the button on the blotter with the reverence due a museum piece. "Ah," he said softly, lifting his loupe to examine the button under the desk lamp. "Water buffalo horn, hand-finished. The holes are beveled by craftsmen who understand that a man's fingers deserve consideration. The rim work is exceptional. No machine marks, no rough edges." He turned the button carefully. "This small crescent notch at the rim, that is not a flaw, but a signature. Only one man in this city finishes horn buttons with this particular technique." "And that man is?" Wolfe prompted. "Heinrich Zimmer. He operates from a workshop on East 62nd Street. Makes perhaps 40 garments per year, each one a small masterpiece. His clients include federal judges, ambassadors, and men who consider $8,000 a reasonable price for proper tailoring." I made a note. "Would Zimmer remember which garment this came from?" Sarti looked at me as if I'd asked whether water was wet. "Mr. Goodwin, Heinrich Zimmer remembers every button he has ever mounted. He keeps records that would impress a Swiss banker. This button will lead you directly to its original garment, and from there to its original owner." The workshop visit. An hour later, I stood in Heinrich Zimmer's workshop, surrounded by bolts of cloth that cost more per yard than most people spent on entire wardrobes. Zimmer himself was a tall, spare man with the bearing of a Prussian officer and hands that moved with surgical precision. He examined the button under a magnifying lamp, turning it twice before consulting a leather-bound ledger that looked like it had been maintained by generations of meticulous German craftsmen. "Ja," he said finally. "This is from a 3-piece suit I completed 14 months ago. Charcoal English wool, Savile Row quality." The client was most particular about the buttons. He ordered 3 dozen extras, saying he was rough on his clothing and wanted adequate replacements. "The client's name?" Zimmer's finger traced down a page of precise handwriting. "Garrick Lane, investment banker. He collected the suit personally and seemed quite pleased with the workmanship. He also mentioned that he would be recommending my services to his business associates." The pieces clicked into place with the satisfaction of a well-oiled lock. "Did he pick up all the extra buttons?" "Nein. He took 2 dozen, left 1 dozen here for safekeeping. He said he traveled frequently and preferred to have replacements available both at home and at his tailor." Zimmer's eyes narrowed with professional concern. "Has something happened to Mr. Lane's suit?" "Something has happened to Mr. Lane's button," I said. "It wandered away from home and ended up where it had no business being." The suspect's movements. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office, reading what appeared to be a treatise on orchid hybridization with the concentration of a general studying battle plans. The button remained on his blotter, but now it seemed less mysterious and more accusatory. "Garrick Lane," I reported. "The button came from a suit Zimmer made for him 14 months ago. Lane ordered extra buttons and kept half at the shop, half at home." Wolfe set down his book and regarded the button with satisfaction. "Of course." Mr. Lane searched Mr. Thorne's apartment, looking for documents related to the consolidated manufacturing acquisition. He was careless enough to lose a button, and Mr. Thorne was observant enough to find it and understand its significance. But why didn't Thorne confront Lane immediately? Because Mr. Thorne was a careful man who understood that accusations require proof beyond a single button. He was gathering evidence, building a case that would be unassailable in court or boardroom. The unexpected revelation. At 2 o'clock, As I was organizing the morning's discoveries into a coherent timeline, the telephone rang with the insistence of urgent news. Miss Channing's voice carried a tension that hadn't been there during her previous calls. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. I've discovered something about the consolidated manufacturing deal that changes everything." "What sort of something?" "The kind that explains why someone would kill to keep it secret." "I'm leaving the office now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She arrived in 15, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had just realized that her quiet legal practice had intersected with something considerably more dangerous. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red leather chair without her usual hesitation. "I've been investigating the consolidated manufacturing acquisition, as you requested. What I found suggests that the environmental liabilities are not the only problem with this deal." She opened the folder and produced a series of documents that looked like they had been photocopied in haste. Consolidated Manufacturing has been systematically falsifying its financial reports for the past 3 years. The company is essentially worthless. Its assets are inflated, its debts are hidden, and its manufacturing capacity is obsolete. Wolfe leaned forward with interest. "And Mr. Lane was aware of this?" "That's what's strange. Based on these documents, Lane should have discovered the fraud during his due diligence, but he was still pushing Thorne to complete the acquisition. Either Lane was incompetent, or he was complicit." The web of deception. I studied the documents Miss Channing had brought. Financial statements that looked impressive on the surface but revealed fundamental problems when examined closely. Environmental reports that had been edited to minimize liability estimates. Correspondence between Consolidated's executives and unnamed third parties discussing management of disclosure requirements. "Miss Channing," I said, "where did you get these documents?" Her composure flickered slightly. "From a source at Consolidated who became concerned about the acquisition. Someone who knew Clive Thorne and respected his reputation for integrity. Someone who wanted Mr. Thorne to discover the truth. Someone who wanted to prevent a massive fraud from succeeding. These documents prove that anyone who acquired Consolidated would lose tens of millions of dollars. Unless, of course, they plan to perpetuate the fraud themselves." The motive crystallizes. Wolfe closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, his fingers finding their familiar position on his belly. The picture becomes clearer. Mr. Lane was not simply pushing for a questionable acquisition, he was orchestrating a deliberate fraud. When Mr. Thorne began to investigate too closely, he became a threat that had to be eliminated. "But why would Lane risk everything for a fraudulent deal?" I asked. Miss Channing consulted her notes. "Because he wasn't planning to lose money. Lane had arranged secondary financing that would have allowed him to extract his investment before the fraud was discovered. He would have made millions while his investors lost everything. Including Mr. Thorne's investment. Especially Mr. Thorne's investment. Thorne was putting up $12 million of his own money, plus another $8 million from his foundation clients. Lane would have walked away with a substantial profit, while Thorne lost everything." The trap revealed. So Lane searched Thorne's apartment looking for evidence that Thorne had discovered the fraud, I said, the pieces falling into place. When he lost the button, Thorne realized he was being watched and investigated. That's when he decided to send the button to you as insurance. Wolfe nodded slowly. Mr. Thorne understood that he was dealing with someone willing to commit fraud on a massive scale. He correctly surmised that such a person might also be willing to commit murder to protect their scheme. "And he was right," Miss Channing said quietly. "The question now is, can we prove it?" The stakes rise. As if summoned by the mention of proof, the telephone rang again. This time it was Inspector Kramer, and his voice carried the weight of a man whose Wednesday had just become considerably more complicated than his Tuesday. "Wolfe, we need to talk. Garrick Lane is missing. His secretary called in a missing person report an hour ago. Lane missed 2 important meetings this morning and isn't answering his phone. His apartment superintendent found his door unlocked and signs of a struggle inside." I felt the familiar chill that comes when a case transforms from intellectual puzzle to immediate danger. Any signs of violence? Blood on the carpet, overturned furniture, and Lane's briefcase missing. Either he's been kidnapped or he's dead and someone wanted it to look like kidnapping. Wolfe's eyes opened. Inspector, I believe Mr. Lane's disappearance is connected to his involvement in a massive financial fraud. Someone has decided that Mr. Lane has become a liability. What fraud? The same fraud that led to Mr. Thorne's murder. Someone killed Mr. Thorne to prevent him from exposing the truth about consolidated manufacturing. Now they've eliminated Mr. Lane for the same reason. The circle of danger. After Kramer hung up, promising to send officers to investigate Lane's apartment more thoroughly, the office fell into the kind of silence that precedes storms. Miss Channing sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, while Wolfe contemplated the button that had started our investigation. Miss Channing, he said finally, you have been most helpful in providing information about this fraud. I trust you understand that you may now be in considerable danger yourself. She nodded. I considered that possibility, but I also considered the possibility that if we don't stop whoever is behind this, more people will die. Indeed. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him we require his services for protective surveillance. Miss Channing will need watching until this matter is resolved. And our next step? I asked. Wolfe picked up the button and held it to the light, where it gleamed like a small, dark promise. We determine who benefited most from both Mr. Thorne's death and Mr. Lane's disappearance. Someone orchestrated this entire scheme, and someone is now eliminating witnesses to protect themselves. The puppet master, I said. Precisely. And puppet masters, in my experience, rarely resist the temptation to take a bow when they believe their performance has been successful. The gathering storm. As afternoon shadows lengthened across West 35th Street, I reflected that our investigation had evolved from a simple matter of a suspicious death to a complex web of fraud, murder, and conspiracy. The button on Wolfe's blotter was no longer just evidence of a burglary. It was the key to understanding a scheme that had already claimed 2 lives and might claim more. The brownstone, which had seemed like a sanctuary from the world's complications, was now the center of an investigation that could easily expand to include additional victims, including, if we weren't careful, us. But Nero Wolfe had never retreated from a challenge, and I had never known him to leave a puzzle unsolved. The game had become deadly serious, but it was still a game that could be won through logic, observation, and the careful application of pressure to the right points. The button waited on the blotter, patient as evidence always is, ready to reveal the final secrets it had been keeping since the night Garrick Lane made the mistake of searching a dead man's apartment and leaving behind proof of his presence. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such mistakes rarely went unpunished and never went unnoticed. Thursday morning brought the kind of news that makes coffee taste like medicine and breakfast feel like an obligation. Saul Panzer called at 8:30 with his usual economy of words, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Archie, they found Garrick Lane. He's alive, but he's been professionally discouraged from talking. Mount Sinai, room 412, police guard at the door. Someone wanted information from him badly enough to break 3 ribs and dislocate his shoulder in the process of asking. I made notes while Fritz hovered nearby, his face wearing the expression of a man who understood that violence had crept closer to his kitchen than he preferred. Conscious? Intermittently. When he's lucid, he keeps asking for protection and mumbling about recordings. The interesting detail is that whoever worked him over knew exactly what questions to ask. This wasn't random persuasion. It was a targeted interrogation. After Saul hung up, I found myself staring at the button on Wolfe's blotter. What had begun as a posthumous message from a careful man had evolved into something that was attracting the kind of attention that left people in hospital beds with police guards. The subtle intrusion. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock sharp, settling into his chair with the deliberate precision of a man whose routines were sacred and whose disruptions were noted. He glanced at the button, then at me, then at the morning mail I had arranged on his desk. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying a note I couldn't immediately identify. "Describe the position of the button when you last observed it." The question struck me as odd until I looked more carefully at the blotter. The button was exactly where it should be, centered, undisturbed, catching the light from the desk lamp. But something felt wrong, the way a familiar room feels different when someone has been through it in your absence. "Dead center on the blotter," I said, studying the scene more carefully. "About 3 inches from the front edge, 2 inches from your pen stand." Wolfe nodded slowly. "And the envelope Miss Channing delivered?" I looked at the envelope, which I had left in the upper right corner of the blotter. It was still there, but the string and wafer seal that had been intact since Miss Channing's visit now showed signs of careful tampering. The red wax had a hairline crack across its surface, and the string appeared to have been retied with practiced but imperfect skill. "Someone's been here," I said, feeling the familiar chill of violation. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The professional assessment. Wolfe's expression grew darker than a storm cloud over the Hudson River. He leaned forward to examine the envelope without touching it, his eyes cataloging details with the precision of a jeweler appraising a suspect diamond. "The wax was probed with a thin blade," he said quietly. "The string was untied, the contents examined, and the seal restored with considerable skill but insufficient perfection. Our visitor was professional, methodical, and confident enough to work in daylight." "How did they get in?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be unsatisfactory. "That question will require investigation. For now, the more pressing concern is what they learned and what they intend to do with that knowledge." I called Inspector Kramer, who received the news with the enthusiasm of a man being invited to his own autopsy. "Someone broke into Wolfe's brownstone? Into his office? And they didn't take anything, just examined evidence?" "That's the essence of it, Inspector. Professional work, minimal disturbance, specific target. They wanted to know what Thorne had sent us and whether we understood its significance." "Which means they now know we're on to them," Kramer said grimly. "Wolfe, this is escalating beyond a simple murder investigation. If these people are willing to break into your fortress, they're desperate enough to do considerably worse." The expanded conspiracy. An hour later, Miss Channing arrived with additional information that transformed our understanding of the case from complex to genuinely dangerous. She carried a manila folder thick with documents and wore the expression of someone who had spent the night discovering that her quiet legal practice had intersected with something considerably more sinister. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red leather chair with visible tension, "I've traced the financial backing behind the consolidated manufacturing acquisition. The secondary financing Lane arranged came through a network of shell companies, but the ultimate source appears to be connected to organized crime." She opened her folder and produced bank records that told a story of money moving through carefully constructed channels designed to obscure its origins. "The Torino family has been using legitimate business deals as money laundering operations. Clive Thorne's partnership with Lane was supposed to be their latest vehicle." Wolfe studied the documents with the attention he usually reserved for orchid breeding charts. "And Mr. Thorne discovered this connection?" 3 weeks ago. That's when he started asking detailed questions about liability insurance and demanding additional due diligence. Lane kept pushing for quick completion, but Thorne insisted on investigating every aspect of the deal. The pattern revealed. I examined the financial records Miss Channing had brought, tracing the flow of money through offshore accounts and dummy corporations. The pattern was sophisticated, but not impenetrable. Someone with Thorne's financial expertise would have eventually uncovered the truth. So Thorne realized his business partner was fronting for organized crime, I said. That's when he decided he needed insurance against whatever Lane might do to silence him. More than that. Miss Channing continued. I've discovered that Thorne had been secretly recording his conversations with Lane for the past month. He suspected something was wrong and wanted evidence of whatever Lane was hiding from him. Wolfe's fingers found their familiar position on his belly. These recordings, where are they now? That's what Lane's attackers were looking for, and I believe that's what they killed Thorne to obtain. The recordings would have exposed not just the fraud, but the organized crime connections behind it. The gathering storm. Before we could fully digest this information, the telephone rang with news that confirmed our worst fears. Dr. Miriam Pell's voice carried the strain of someone whose academic world had suddenly become considerably more dangerous. Mr. Goodwin, someone broke into the Foundation offices last night. They took our financial records, specifically anything related to Clive Thorne's pledge. The security guard who tried to stop them is in intensive care. Within the hour, Dr. Pell had arrived at the brownstone, escorted by one of Saul's operatives and carrying the remnants of files that painted a disturbing picture of the Foundation's unwitting involvement in money laundering operations. Dr. Pell, Wolfe said after she had settled into her chair, please describe exactly what was taken. She consulted a handwritten list with the precision of someone who had spent a sleepless night cataloging losses. All documentation related to Clive's pledge, including correspondence about anonymous donors he had arranged for us. They seemed particularly interested in our educational program funding records. Anonymous donors, I repeated. Donors who preferred to remain unidentified for tax reasons? That's what Clive told me. He said some wealthy individuals wanted to support education but needed discretion in their charitable giving. He handled those arrangements personally. Miss Channing and I exchanged glances. The pattern was becoming clear. The Foundation had been used as another vehicle for laundering illegal profits, with Thorne serving as an unwitting facilitator until he began to understand what was really happening. The trap prepared. Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, his eyes closed, his massive frame motionless, except for the slight movement of his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had reached a decision. Ladies, you are both in considerable danger. The people we are dealing with have already committed murder and attempted kidnapping. They will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their operations. What do you propose? Miss Channing asked. We arrange for them to come to us, Wolfe said with the tone of a man who had just decided to invite wolves to dinner. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I will gather all the principals in this case. I will announce that we have recovered Mr. Thorne's recordings and are prepared to turn them over to the authorities. I felt my eyebrows perform their familiar exercise. And do we actually have these recordings? We will have something that serves the same purpose, Wolfe said cryptically. The truth, properly presented, can be more compelling than any mechanical reproduction of conversation. The bait set. That afternoon, I made a series of telephone calls that would either solve our case or get us all killed in the attempt. I contacted Mrs. Leda Thorne, informing her that new evidence had come to light regarding her ex-husband's death and that her presence was required at 10 o'clock the following morning. I left similar messages for Dr. Pell and arranged for Miss Channing to return under Saul's protection. Each call was brief, professional, and designed to create the impression that we had discovered something significant enough to warrant a formal gathering. If our theory was correct, word of these meetings would reach the right ears through channels we couldn't trace but could certainly predict. The sanctuary restored. As evening settled over West 35th Street, I reflected on the violation of our brownstone security. Someone had been bold enough to enter Wolfe's sanctuary, examine his evidence, and leave with the knowledge they sought. But in doing so, they had also revealed the extent of their desperation and the sophistication of their operation. The button remained on Wolfe's blotter, no longer just a piece of evidence, but a symbol of the careful game we were playing with people who had already proven their willingness to kill. Tomorrow would bring either justice or considerable unpleasantness, and possibly both. Wolfe emerged from his evening session with the orchids wearing the expression of a man who had found peace among his plants and was prepared to wage war among his fellow humans. The brownstone had been violated, but it had not been conquered. The game was entering its final phase, and Nero Wolfe had never been known to lose a game that mattered. In his world, they all mattered, especially the ones that began with a dead man's foresight and a button that had traveled too far from home. There are violations that leave marks you can see, and violations that leave marks you can feel. Thursday night's uninvited examination of our office fell into the second category, and the brownstone wore its invisible wound like a patient with a fever. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt right. Fritz moved through his morning routine with the precision of a Swiss timepiece that had been wound too tight. His usual cheerful humming was absent, replaced by the kind of purposeful silence that meant he was thinking dangerous thoughts about people who tampered with his nutmeg. Even the coffee tasted different, though whether that was Fritz's mood or my own was anybody's guess. I found myself checking locks, testing window latches, and generally behaving like a man who had discovered his sanctuary wasn't as impregnable as advertised. The button remained on Wolfe's blotter, exactly where it should be, but somehow it seemed smaller now, less like evidence and more like bait that had attracted the wrong kind of fish. Wolfe's strategic response. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11 sharp, carrying himself with the deliberate dignity of a man whose fortress had been probed but not conquered. He settled into his chair, arranged his bulk with familiar precision, and regarded the button with the satisfaction of a chess player who had anticipated his opponent's move. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "Our uninvited guests have confirmed what we suspected and revealed what we needed to know. They understand the significance of Mr. Thorne's token, and their desperation has made them careless. Careless enough to get caught. Careless enough to be predictable. When intelligent men become desperate, they often revert to patterns that serve them in simpler circumstances. Our task is to recognize those patterns and position ourselves accordingly." He reached for the telephone with the deliberation of a general issuing orders. "Saul, please, we require your services for a more active phase of this investigation." The hospital visit. 20 minutes later, I was navigating the antiseptic corridors of Mount Sinai, following directions to room 412, where Garrick Lane was discovering that private medical care doesn't necessarily include protection from the consequences of poor business decisions. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins occupied a chair outside Lane's door with the enthusiasm of a man guarding a tax audit. 5 minutes, Goodwin," he warned as I approached. "The doc says he's still pretty scrambled, and Kramer wants him conscious enough to make sense when the DA gets here." Lane looked like expensive luggage that had been checked by gorillas and lost by amateurs. His right eye was the color of a ripe plum, his left shoulder was strapped against his chest, and somebody had used his rib cage for percussion practice. But his remaining good eye tracked my movement with the clarity of a man whose brain was working better than his body. "Lane," I said, taking the bedside chair, "Archie Goodwin, I understand you've had an educational conversation with some people who wanted to know about recordings." He tried to speak, winced, then tried again. "They knew exactly what to ask." His voice was a whisper with sharp edges. "Where Thorne kept them. How many copies? And what did you tell them?" "Truth." He closed his eyes briefly. "Don't know. Thorne said insurance policy. Never told me. Where?" I leaned closer. "But you had ideas." His good eye opened and fixed on me with surprising intensity. "Blue light, 607. Canary." The words came out like he was spending his last coins. He said that once, when he was angry about the deal. "Blue light, 607. Canary," I repeated. "That mean anything specific to you?" "Foundation, basement storage. Thorne had access through Pell." His breathing became labored. "Yellow tag, archives." The storage discovery. An hour later, I was standing in the basement of the Verbank building with the superintendent, a man named Kowalski who had the bearing of someone who had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. The basement was a maze of wire cages, numbered and padlocked, containing the accumulated debris of business lives. 607, Kowalski said, leading me down a corridor lit by blue LED strips. Meridian Foundation rents it for archived grant applications. Dr. Pell has the key, comes down maybe once a month to file stuff. The cage was 8 feet square, filled with filing boxes and document storage containers. But what caught my attention was a yellow tag marked "Archives Do Not Move," attached to a locked plastic bin that sat apart from the paper files. "That bin," I said. "How long has it been there?" Kowalski consulted a clipboard. Dr. Pell brought it down 3 weeks ago, said it was sensitive foundation documents that needed secure storage. I called Wolfe from the building lobby. "The recordings exist," I reported. Lane's cryptic message led to a storage cage rented by the Meridian Foundation. There's a locked container that's been there exactly 3 weeks, right around the time Thorne started getting nervous about his business partner. "Excellent. Do not attempt to examine the container. Our purpose is to confirm its existence, not to possess its contents. Return immediately." The network activated. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe orchestrating what he called a strategic deployment of assets, and what I called putting all our eggs in one very dangerous basket. He had called in the full network: Saul Panzer for surveillance, Fred Durkin for close observation, and Ori Cather for backup coverage. "The situation has evolved beyond simple investigation," Wolfe explained as I settled at my desk. "We are now dealing with people who have committed murder to protect a financial fraud, and who are prepared to commit additional murders to maintain their security. Subtlety is no longer sufficient." Saul called in at 2:30 with his first report. "The black sedan is back, different plates but same occupants. They're not trying very hard to be invisible, which means they want you to know they're watching. Classic intimidation pattern." "Any movement toward the building?" "Negative. They're maintaining distance but constant observation. Professional work, but they're not planning immediate action. They're waiting for something." Fred checked in an hour later. Leda Thorne had lunch with her lawyer, and a man who looks like he presses his suits with a steamroller and his enemies with something heavier. They exchanged envelopes, and she didn't look happy about whatever was in hers. Ori's report on Dr. Pell was more troubling. She tried to access the Foundation's basement storage this morning, but was turned away by building security. Someone had flagged the area as part of an ongoing police investigation. She made several phone calls from her car afterward, and she was agitated enough to attract attention. The pressure applied. By 4 o'clock, Wolfe had positioned his pieces on the board with the precision of a master strategist. He called Inspector Kramer and arranged for police surveillance of the storage facility. He contacted the building superintendent and requested that access to cage 607 be restricted to authorized personnel only. He even called Lon Cohen at the Gazette and suggested that a story about new developments in the Thorne investigation might be of interest to his readers. "You're making yourself a target," I observed as he completed his calls. "I'm making myself the primary target," he corrected. "Better that they focus their attention on me than continue eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence. Sometimes the best defense is to become too visible to attack safely." The telephone rang at 5:15. Miss Channing's voice carried a tension that hadn't been there during our previous conversations. "Mr. Goodwin, I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. Someone tried to break into my apartment last night, and my office received a call this morning suggesting that my health might benefit from a vacation in a warmer climate." "How immediate is immediately?" "I'm in a taxi 3 blocks away, and I've been looking over my shoulder since breakfast." The stakes revealed, when Miss Channing arrived, escorted by one of Saul's associates and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had been packed in haste, her usual professional composure had been replaced by the kind of alertness that comes from understanding that academic discussions of legal theory had suddenly become matters of personal survival. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling into the red leather chair with visible relief, "I've discovered why they're so desperate to recover those recordings. The consolidated manufacturing fraud is just the tip of the iceberg. Thorne stumbled onto a money laundering operation that spans 3 states and involves dozens of legitimate businesses." She opened her briefcase and produced documents that painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation on a scale that made our original investigation look like a parking ticket dispute. The foundation was being used as one of several vehicles for converting illegal profits into charitable tax deductions. Thorne's pledge wasn't overdue. It was being used to process money that came from sources he never suspected. Wolfe studied the documents with the attention he usually reserved for orchid breeding charts. Dr. Pell's foundation was an unwitting participant. Completely unwitting. But when Thorne began asking questions about the anonymous donors he had arranged, Dr. Pell started investigating on her own. That's when she discovered that some of the donations were coming through accounts that didn't exist on paper. The final preparation. As evening settled over West 35th Street, the brownstone took on the atmosphere of a fortress preparing for siege. Saul had positioned additional surveillance around the building. Fritz had prepared dinner with the efficiency of a man who understood that normal routines were the best defense against abnormal circumstances. The button remained on Wolfe's blotter, no longer just evidence but a symbol of the careful game we were playing with people who had already proven their willingness to kill. "Tomorrow," Wolfe announced as we finished our meal, "we will gather all the principals in this case. I will present them with a choice between cooperation and exposure. Some will choose wisely, others will not. And if they choose violence instead of wisdom, then Inspector Kramer will have the opportunity to demonstrate why the New York Police Department maintains a reputation for effective response to immediate threats." I spent the evening checking locks, testing the alarm system, and generally behaving like a man who had learned that even the most secure sanctuaries could be violated by people with sufficient motivation and inadequate scruples. The calm before resolution. As I prepared for bed, I reflected that our investigation had evolved from an intellectual puzzle into something considerably more dangerous. The button that had started our journey was about to unlock secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect, and tomorrow would determine whether justice or expedience would prevail. The brownstone settled into its nighttime quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before storms rather than after them. Outside, I could see the shadow of the surveillance car, and I knew that somewhere in the darkness, other eyes were watching and other minds were planning. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such moments usually preceded either triumph or catastrophe, and sometimes both. The game was entering its final phase, and all the pieces were finally in position for whatever endgame awaited us in the morning light. The button waited on the blotter, patient as evidence always is, ready to reveal the final secrets it had been keeping since the night Garrick Lane made the mistake of searching a dead man's apartment and leaving behind proof of his presence. Tomorrow would bring either justice or considerable unpleasantness, and quite possibly both. Friday morning brought the kind of crisp October air that makes every sound carry and every shadow sharp. I was at my desk by 8:30, arranging what Wolfe had termed the final act of our little drama, which in plain English meant we were about to corner a killer and see whether they preferred confession or violence as their method of resolution. The morning edition of the Gazette carried Lon Cohen's carefully crafted item on page 3. Sources close to private investigator Nero Wolfe suggest that audio recordings made by the late financier Clive Thorne may shed new light on his suspicious death. Police declined comment, but the recordings allegedly document conversations about questionable business practices in the days before Thorne's fatal fall. It was 3 paragraphs of speculation wrapped around 1 sentence of strategic bait, designed to flush our quarry into the open. The telephone began its morning calisthenics before I had finished my 2nd cup of Fritz's coffee. The first call came from Lady Thorne, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had been unpleasantly surprised by her morning newspaper. "Mr. Goodwin," she said with crystalline precision, "I dislike discovering developments in my ex-husband's case through the financial pages. If recordings exist, I expect to hear them. Mrs. Thorne, you and everyone else with a legitimate interest will have that opportunity at 11 o'clock this morning. Attendance is mandatory, candor is recommended." "I possess both qualities in abundance," she replied, and the line went dead with emphasis. The intelligence network activated. Saul Panzer's morning report confirmed that our newspaper gambit was producing the desired results. "The black sedan is back," he informed me over the secure line, "with different plates but the same occupants. They're not trying to be invisible anymore, which means they want you to know they're watching. Classic intimidation pattern, but it also means they're getting desperate." "Any movement toward the building?" "Negative on direct approach, but they've been making frequent phone calls. I count at least 6 different conversations in the past hour. Whatever network they're part of is definitely activated." Fred Durkin checked in with equally interesting intelligence. "That lawyer Baird, Arthur Baird from Harrow and Baird, he had breakfast with a gentleman who presses his suits with a steamroller and his enemies with something considerably heavier. They exchanged envelopes, and Baird looked like a man who had just been given instructions he didn't particularly want to follow." The pieces were falling into place with the satisfying precision of a well-engineered mechanism. Our morning publicity had accomplished exactly what Wolfe had intended. It had forced our adversaries to reveal themselves through their reactions. Wolfe's strategic positioning. Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at precisely 11 o'clock, carrying himself with the deliberate dignity of a general who had finished reviewing his battle plans and was prepared to engage the enemy. He settled into his chair, arranged his considerable bulk with familiar precision, and regarded the button on his blotter with the satisfaction of a man who understood that small objects could unlock large secrets. "Archie," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decision, "our morning's work has been productive. The newspaper item has produced the desired agitation among our suspects, and their responses have confirmed our theoretical framework. It is time to apply direct pressure." He reached for the telephone with the deliberation of a man who understood that words, properly deployed, could be more devastating than weapons. "Please connect me to Mr. Arthur Baird at Harrow and Baird. Tell him that Nero Wolfe wishes to discuss his client's posthumous instructions regarding certain recordings." The conversation that followed was brief but illuminating. Baird's voice carried the controlled tension of a man who had been expecting this call, but hoping it wouldn't come. "Mr. Wolfe," Baird said after the usual pleasantries, "I understand you've been making inquiries about my former client's affairs. As his attorney, I must insist that any materials he may have left be turned over to the proper authorities through appropriate legal channels." "Mr. Baird," Wolfe replied with deceptive mildness, "I find it curious that you describe Mr. Thorne as your former client when your current client, Mrs. Thorne, has been using her divorce proceedings to gather detailed information about his financial affairs. Information that has subsequently found its way to parties with distinctly criminal interests." The silence that followed had weight to it, like the pause before thunder. When Baird finally spoke, his voice had acquired a harder edge. "Mr. Wolfe, I think you'll find that accusations are considerably easier to make than to prove. I suggest you be very careful about the implications you choose to voice. Mr. Baird, I suggest you join us at 11:30 this morning to discuss those implications in person. I believe you'll find the conversation illuminating." The gathering storm. By 11:15, the office had been transformed into what Fritz privately called the tribunal room. Chairs arranged in a careful semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, the button positioned prominently on the blotter, and a manila folder marked "Thorne Recordings Transcripts" placed where our visitors couldn't help but notice it. The folder was empty, but appearances often matter more than contents when dealing with people whose nerves are already stretched thin. Dr. Miriam Pell arrived first, escorted by a compact woman in a navy suit who introduced herself as legal counsel. Dr. Pell carried herself with the dignity of an academic who had discovered that her ivory tower had been built on quicksand, but her eyes held the alertness of someone who understood that survival sometimes required abandoning theoretical discussions in favor of practical decisions. "Dr. Pell," Wolfe said as she settled into the red leather chair, "I trust you understand that your foundation's unwitting involvement in money laundering operations does not make you culpable, but it does make your cooperation essential." She folded her hands in her lap with the precision of someone who had spent a sleepless night considering her options. "Mr. Wolfe, I've reviewed every transaction, every donation, every grant we've made in the past 2 years. The anonymous donations that Clive arranged for us, they totaled nearly $2 million, money that supported genuinely beneficial programs. Money that also provided legitimacy for criminal enterprises that required the appearance of charitable giving. Your foundation was being used, Dr. Pell, but you are not complicit in that use." The puppet master revealed, "Leda Thorne arrived at 11:25, dressed in black with the kind of understated elegance that costs more than most people earn in a month." She entered the office like a woman walking into a courtroom where she expected to be both prosecutor and judge, her eyes immediately cataloguing the theatrical props I had arranged. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, taking the chair beside Dr. Pell, "I assume this gathering will finally resolve the questions surrounding my ex-husband's death. I have other appointments that require my attention. Mrs. Thorne, your other appointments will wait. Your divorce attorney has been using your settlement negotiations as cover for a considerably more sinister enterprise." Before she could respond, the office door opened to admit Arthur Baird himself, accompanied by Miss Channing and a man I didn't recognize, but whose expensive suit and careful grooming suggested he was accustomed to having his suggestions treated as commands. Baird was a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that suggested success and respectability. But his eyes held the desperation of a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, settling into the remaining chair without invitation, "I believe we need to discuss the return of certain materials that belong to my client's interests." "Mr. Baird," Wolfe replied with the calm of a man who had anticipated this moment, "we need to discuss your orchestration of a money laundering scheme that has resulted in murder." The web exposed. The room fell into the kind of silence that precedes explosions, with everyone calculating distances, options, and the probable consequences of various courses of action. The button sat on Wolfe's blotter like a small, dark witness to the confrontation that was about to determine whether justice or expedience would prevail. "3 weeks ago," Wolfe continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "you inquired in a partners' meeting about environmental liability insurance for the consolidated manufacturing acquisition. You also made discreet inquiries about your client's financial records, ostensibly for divorce proceedings, but actually to identify opportunities for your criminal associates." Baird's composure flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Mr. Wolfe, you're making serious accusations without evidence." "I have the evidence, Mr. Baird. Mr. Thorne recorded his conversations with Mr. Lane, conversations in which Lane admitted to searching Thorne's apartment at your direction. The button he left behind was merely confirmation of what the recordings had already revealed." Miss Channing opened her briefcase and produced bank records that painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation. "Mr. Baird has been feeding information about wealthy clients to criminal associates for the past 3 years. The divorce gave him access to Clive's complete financial profile, which he used to identify potential money laundering opportunities." The moment of truth. Baird's companion shifted slightly in his chair, his hand moving toward his jacket with the casual precision of someone reaching for a familiar tool. But before he could complete the motion, The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Inspector Kramer and what sounded like a significant portion of the New York Police Department. "Mr. Baird," Wolfe said with quiet satisfaction, "I believe you have made an error in calculation. You assumed we were unprepared for this conversation." The Brownstones' front door opened with the authority of a search warrant, and our morning gathering was about to become considerably more official. The game had reached its endgame, and all the pieces were finally in position for whatever resolution awaited us in the next few minutes. The button gleamed on the blotter, small and dark and patient, having finally revealed all the secrets it had been keeping since the night Garrick Lane made the mistake of searching a dead man's apartment and leaving behind proof of his presence. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such moments usually preceded either triumph or catastrophe, and quite possibly both. If you want to understand how quickly a room's atmosphere can change from tense to electric, arrange for Inspector Kramer to arrive with 3 uniformed officers and the kind of expression that suggests someone's morning is about to become considerably worse. The sound of their measured footsteps on our front stairs carried the weight of official authority. When they filled the office doorway at 11:30 sharp, the assembled company understood that our gathering had transformed from consultation to confrontation. Kramer surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of a man who had finally found the loose thread that would unravel the entire sweater. Dr. Miriam Pell sat with her attorney, hands folded with academic precision. Leda Thorne occupied her chair like a queen awaiting either coronation or execution. Arthur Baird maintained his professional composure, but his companion, the man I had mentally labeled steamroller, now seemed less like expensive muscle and more like a liability counting exits. "Wolfe," Kramer said, settling into his usual chair while his officers positioned themselves strategically. "I trust this gathering will provide more illumination than your usual theatrical productions." "Inspector," Wolfe replied, his massive frame settling deeper into the red leather chair. "It will provide resolution. The truth, properly presented, requires no theatrical enhancement." The Button's testament. Fritz had removed the tea service, a wise precaution when dealing with people whose morning coffee had been seasoned with desperation. The Button remained on Wolfe's blotter, dark and patient, catching the light like a small witness preparing to testify. Wolfe lifted it between thumb and forefinger, turning it once so the tiny crescent notch caught the light. "This token began as a craftsman's pride," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It became, through carelessness, a confession. Mr. Thorne found it on his bedroom floor after his apartment had been searched. He knew 2 things. It did not belong to him, and it had not been there that morning." Arthur Baird's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Wolfe, surely you don't expect us to believe that a simple button—" "Nothing about this button is simple, Mr. Baird," Wolfe interrupted. "Heinrich Zimmer's records identify it as belonging to a 3-piece charcoal suit made 14 months ago for Garrick Lane. Mr. Lane, who urged Mr. Thorne to complete a ruinous acquisition and, failing to persuade him through legitimate means, resorted to trespass. Miss Channing opened her briefcase and produced the financial documents that had occupied much of our recent attention. The consolidated manufacturing acquisition was designed as a money laundering vehicle," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Mr. Lane was pushing the deal because he was being directed by someone who needed legitimate businesses to process illegal profits." The web revealed. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe continued, being methodical in all things, kept the button and began his own investigation. He discovered that his business partner was fronting for a criminal enterprise, and he began recording their conversations as insurance against whatever action his discovery might provoke. Dr. Pell's attorney leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Pell's foundation was being used for money laundering?" "Unwittingly," Wolfe said with gentle firmness. "The anonymous donations Mr. Thorne arranged came through shell corporations designed to convert criminal profits into charitable tax deductions. Your Foundation's programs were legitimate, but the funding was not. Leda Thorne's composure cracked slightly. Arthur, tell me you didn't use my divorce proceedings to gather intelligence for criminals. Baird's silence was more eloquent than any denial. The murder exposed. 3 weeks ago, Wolfe said, his voice hardening. When Mr. Thorne's questions became too pointed and his investigation too thorough, you decided he had become a liability that required permanent solution. You arranged to meet him in the stairwell of the Verbank building, ostensibly to negotiate his silence. Speculation, Baird said, but his voice lacked conviction. Deduction, Wolfe corrected. When Mr. Thorne refused to abandon his investigation, you pushed him over the railing. A crime of opportunity disguised as accident, but betrayed by your desperation to recover the recordings he had made. Kramer consulted his notebook. We have Lane's hospital testimony about the apartment search. We have financial records showing the money laundering operation, and we have witness statements placing you in the stairwell shortly after Thorne left the reception. Sergeant Stebbins stepped forward. We also lifted fingerprints from Lane's apartment that match prints found on the stairwell handrail at the Verbank building. Same prints that showed up when someone searched this office 2 days ago. The trap closes. Baird's companion shifted in his chair, and I saw his hand move toward his jacket with practiced efficiency. But Stebbins was faster, and in 3 seconds the man's arm was bent at an angle that arms don't appreciate while his weapon clattered to the floor. Anthony Caro, Kramer said, producing handcuffs with professional satisfaction. Outstanding warrants in 3 states, and now we can add assault and conspiracy to the list. Baird stood carefully, his professional dignity crumbling like a house built on sand. You have circumstantial evidence and the testimony of criminals. No prosecutor will, Mr. Baird, Wolfe said with quiet finality. We have the recordings. Mr. Thorne was more careful than you imagined. Blue Light 607, Canary, the storage facility beneath the Verbank building, where he kept his insurance policy in a Foundation archive box marked with a yellow tag. The color drained from Baird's face as he realized that his victim's foresight had been more comprehensive than his own planning. Justice administered. Arthur Baird, Kramer said formally. You're under arrest for the murder of Clive Thorne and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent, though in your case, silence might have been a better strategy from the beginning. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Baird finally spoke, his voice hollow with defeat. It was supposed to be simple financial arrangements, clean money, legitimate businesses. Everybody profits. Mr. Baird, Wolfe said with the patience of a teacher correcting a slow student, when you chose to betray your client's trust for criminal profit, you made violence inevitable. Mr. Thorne died because he possessed the integrity you had abandoned. The aftermath. As Kramer's men led their prisoners away, the office gradually returned to its natural quiet. Dr. Pell sat in contemplative silence, understanding that her foundation would require considerable rehabilitation, but that her programs had genuinely helped the people they were designed to serve. Dr. Pell, Wolfe said gently, your cooperation with the authorities will be essential, but your culpability is minimal. You were deceived, not complicit. Leda Thorne gathered her purse with movements that suggested a woman reconsidering her assumptions about her ex-husband. Clive was trying to do the right thing, she said quietly. I used to think his honesty was naive. Now I understand it was courageous. Miss Channing closed her briefcase with the relief of someone who had survived a dangerous game. Will the Foundation's programs survive the scandal? Programs that serve genuine needs usually do, Wolfe said. It is the people who exploit such programs who rarely survive exposure. The Button's final service. After our visitors had departed, Wolfe picked up the button from his blotter and held it to the light one final time. The tiny crescent notch that had identified its maker now seemed like a signature on a confession. Archie, he said, this small object has served its purpose admirably. It connected a careful man's foresight to a careless man's downfall. And now? Now it joins our collection of tokens, evidence that human folly often leaves behind exactly the clues necessary for its own exposure. He opened the safe and placed the button inside, next to other mementos of cases solved and justice served. The brownstone restored. As evening settled over West 35th Street, Fritz hummed contentedly in the kitchen, preparing a dinner that would celebrate the restoration of our sanctuary's security. The button had found its final resting place, no longer evidence, but a reminder that small objects could unlock large secrets when placed in the hands of someone who understood their significance. "You know," I said, settling at my desk to type up the final report. Thorne was smarter than his killer gave him credit for. "Indeed," Wolfe said, opening a book on orchid cultivation. He understood that the best insurance policy is not the one you hope never to use, but the one that works perfectly when you need it most. Outside, the city continued its eternal dance of ambition and consequence, but inside the brownstone, order had been restored. The game was over, justice had been served, and Nero Wolfe had once again proven that careful observation, logical deduction, and the right kind of pressure applied to the right people could unravel even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The button that had solved the murder now rested in darkness, its work complete, waiting to join the long conversation of evidence and resolution that filled our safe with the tokens of human folly and the satisfaction of truth revealed. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such endings were both inevitable and temporary. There would always be another mystery, another careless criminal, another careful victim who understood that sometimes the smallest objects carry the largest truths. But tonight, that was enough. If you've ever watched a house let out its breath after holding it too long, you'll understand what happened to our brownstone Saturday morning. The handcuffs had stopped clicking, the official footsteps had faded down West 35th Street, and the walls seemed to settle back into their familiar positions. Even the air tasted different, less like tension and more like the coffee Fritz had been brewing with renewed enthusiasm since Inspector Kramer's departure. I was at my desk by 9, transforming the chaos of the past week into the kind of orderly reports that make district attorneys smile and defense lawyers reach for stronger coffee. The button sat on Wolfe's blotter one final time, dark and patient, having completed its journey from evidence to testimony to symbol. In a few hours, it would join the other tokens in our safe, mementos of human folly and the satisfaction of truth properly revealed. The telephone had been performing morning calisthenics since 8:30, bringing news that confirmed our theoretical framework while adding details that painted the complete picture of Arthur Baird's criminal enterprise. The recordings recovered. Inspector Kramer's first call carried the satisfaction of a man whose patience with clever criminals had been rewarded with comprehensive evidence. Wolfe was right about the storage facility, he reported. Thorne's insurance policy was exactly where Lane's coded message suggested. Cage 607 in the Verbank building basement. The recovery had been textbook police work. Proper warrants, careful documentation, and the kind of methodical approach that makes evidence stick in court. 23 hours of digital recordings, documenting conversations between Thorne and Lane that revealed the systematic corruption of legitimate business relationships for criminal profit. Lane's cooperation is complete, Kramer continued. Once he realized we had the recordings and the financial evidence, he decided survival trumped loyalty. He's providing names, dates, and enough details to keep federal prosecutors busy for months. The recordings themselves told a story of gradual discovery and growing alarm. Thorne's voice, calm and methodical, asking increasingly pointed questions about financing sources and environmental liabilities. Lane's responses, initially confident but becoming more evasive as Thorne's investigation deepened. The final recordings, made just days before Thorne's death, captured Lane's desperate attempts to rush the consolidated manufacturing acquisition before his partner could uncover the truth. The network dismantled. By noon, the scope of Baird's criminal enterprise had expanded beyond our original investigation into something that would require federal attention and international cooperation. The money laundering operation had tentacles reaching through 3 states and dozens of legitimate businesses that had been corrupted by criminal investment. Lon Cohen called from the Gazette with the enthusiasm of a reporter who had been handed a story that would sell papers and win awards. Archie, this Baird character wasn't just laundering money. He was running a criminal consulting service. Divorce attorneys, estate planners, business lawyers, anyone with access to wealthy clients' financial information. Don't make him sound more sophisticated than he was, I warned. He was a lawyer who sold his professional access for criminal profit. The rest is just bookkeeping. But the bookkeeping was impressive in its scope and audacity. Shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, numbered accounts in Switzerland, and a network of legitimate businesses that had been purchased with illegal funds and operated as fronts for continued criminal activity. The Torino family's business interests would be under federal scrutiny for years. Character resolutions. Miss Channing arrived at 2 o'clock with the final paperwork that would close our involvement in the case. She carried herself with the relief of someone who had survived a dangerous game and was prepared to return to the quieter challenges of legitimate legal practice. "The foundation will survive," she reported, settling into the red leather chair that had hosted so many revelations over the past week. "Dr. Pell's cooperation with the federal investigation has been complete, and the authorities understand that her organization was exploited rather than complicit. The Meridian Foundation's programs would continue under court supervision until the source of their funding could be properly audited and legitimized. The children who had learned to read through their literacy programs wouldn't suffer because their education had been funded with laundered money. Knowledge remained valuable regardless of its financial origins." Leda Thorne's vindication had come in the form of a formal apology from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, acknowledging that her divorce proceedings had been manipulated by her own attorney for criminal purposes. Her settlement would be reopened, but this time to ensure proper compensation rather than to facilitate money laundering schemes. "She called this morning," Miss Channing reported. "She wanted you to know that she's withdrawing her petition to reopen the original settlement. She said Clive was a better man than she had given him credit for, and that his death shouldn't be used to profit from his honesty." The domestic restoration. Fritz had spent the morning engaged in what he privately called purification rituals, scrubbing every surface that had been touched by criminal hands, polishing doorknobs that had been turned by people with questionable intentions, and generally restoring the brownstone's moral as well as physical cleanliness. The lunch he served at 1 o'clock was a masterpiece of comfort and celebration. Squab stuffed with morel d'uxelles, pomezana crisp enough to salute, and asparagus that knew when to stand at attention. The wine, a Volnay that had waited exactly long enough for this moment, complemented the meal with the kind of perfection that makes you understand why some people consider Fritz's cooking a form of prayer. Wolfe gave the menu its due attention, then set down his fork and addressed the room with the air of a man who had reached conclusions worth sharing. Wolfe's philosophical reflection. "An object as modest as a button," he said, his voice carrying the weight of considered judgment, "represents a promise between maker and wearer, between craft and care. When such an object appears where it should not be, it becomes more than evidence. It becomes a repudiation of that promise." He lifted the button from the blotter, turning it once so the tiny crescent notch caught the light. Mr. Thorne understood this. He recognized that carelessness in small matters often indicates carelessness in large ones. Mr. Baird's lost button was not merely a token of his presence in places he should not have been. It was a symbol of his willingness to abandon the promises that define civilized behavior. I buttered a piece of bread with attention, understanding that Wolfe's observations about buttons were really observations about human nature. Baird made larger promises too, I said, to clients, to the legal profession, to society. He broke those as carelessly as he lost his button. Precisely, Wolfe said. Scale is immaterial when discussing integrity. A man who betrays small trusts will inevitably betray large ones. Mr. Thorne's foresight in preserving this token ensured that Mr. Baird's carelessness would ultimately expose his criminality. The button's final service. After Miss Channing departed and the afternoon settled into its familiar rhythm, I performed the final act of our investigation. The button, having served its purpose as evidence, testimony, and symbol, was ready to join the other mementos in our safe, tokens of cases solved and justice served. "Archie," Wolfe said as I prepared to open the safe, "that small object has demonstrated something important about the nature of evidence. Physical proof is valuable, but understanding the significance of that proof requires intelligence, observation, and the willingness to follow logical conclusions wherever they lead." I placed the button in the safe next to other tokens from previous cases. A fountain pen that had revealed a forger's identity, a theater ticket that had exposed a murderer's alibi, a chess piece that had unlocked the secrets of a criminal conspiracy. Each object had its own story, its own moment of revelation, its own contribution to the long conversation between human folly and human justice. The return to equilibrium. As evening settled over West 35th Street, the brownstone completed its return to normal operations. Fritz hummed contentedly in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the satisfaction of a man whose domain had been restored to proper order. The orchids in the plant rooms continued their eternal dance of growth and bloom, indifferent to human criminality but responsive to careful attention. Wolfe emerged from his evening session with the plants wearing the expression of a man who had found peace among living things and was prepared to defend that peace against those who would threaten it. The case was closed, justice had been served, and order had been restored to our small corner of Manhattan. "You know," I said, settling at my desk to complete the final reports, "Thorne was smarter than his killer gave him credit for." "Indeed," Wolfe said, opening a book on orchid hybridization. "He understood that the best insurance policy is not the one you hope never to use, but the one that works perfectly when you need it most." The eternal cycle. Outside, the city continued its eternal dance of ambition and consequence, but inside the brownstone, equilibrium had been restored. The game was over, justice had been served, and Nero Wolfe had once again proven that careful observation, logical deduction, and the right kind of pressure applied to the right people could unravel even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The button that had solved the murder now rested in darkness, its work complete, joining the long conversation of evidence and resolution that filled our safe with tokens of human folly and the satisfaction of truth revealed. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such endings were both inevitable and temporary. There would always be another mystery, another careless criminal, another careful victim who understood that sometimes the smallest objects carry the largest truths. But tonight, that was enough. The brownstone settled into its nighttime quiet, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and that the sanctuary of West 35th Street remained inviolate. The button had done its work, the case was closed, and tomorrow would bring whatever new challenges the city might offer to a man who understood that human nature, however flawed, could still be held accountable to the demands of truth and justice. In the end, that understanding was perhaps the most valuable thing we had accomplished, the confirmation that careful men could still prevail against careless criminals, and that small objects, properly interpreted, could unlock the largest secrets of all. The appetite for justice, like Fritz's cooking, was best served at the proper temperature and with the right accompaniments. Tonight we had achieved both. If peace has a sound on West 35th Street, It's Fritz humming over his morning preparations and the house settling back into its natural rhythm. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp October air that makes every sound carry clearly, and by 9 o'clock the brownstone had stopped bristling like a cat that had finally convinced itself the intruders were gone for good. I was at my desk, transforming the chaos of the past week into the kind of orderly reports that make district attorneys smile and defense lawyers reach for stronger coffee. The button was gone from Wolfe's blotter, secured in our safe alongside other tokens of human folly and investigative success. But its absence felt more like completion than emptiness, the way a sentence feels when it reaches its proper period rather than trailing off into uncertainty. The morning edition carried Lon Cohen's follow-up story. Recordings expose lawyers' murder money laundering network. 3 columns of solid journalism that would probably win him recognition and certainly wouldn't embarrass anyone who had cooperated with our investigation. He'd sent over a note by messenger. "You got me page 1 without spilling my coffee. Owe you dinner." Official satisfaction. Inspector Kramer called at 10:30 with the kind of comprehensive update that transforms messy criminal enterprises into neat prosecutorial packages. "The federal boys are taking over the money laundering investigation," he reported with the satisfaction of a man who had solved his piece of the puzzle and was prepared to let others handle the paperwork. "Baird's cooperation has been swift and complete," he continued. "Once he heard those recordings, he decided the electric chair wasn't worth protecting the Torino family's business interests. His plea bargain will put him away for life and dismantle their entire operation." Arthur Baird's appetite for criminal profit had led him to betray client confidences, orchestrate fraudulent business deals, and ultimately commit murder to protect his schemes. Now that same appetite would be satisfied with prison food and the knowledge that his careful legal career had ended in comprehensive disgrace. "Lane's recovery is proceeding according to medical expectations," Kramer added. "His cooperation has earned him consideration for witness protection. Turns out he'd been feeding information about potential targets to Baird's criminal associates for over a year. Thorne was just the first victim smart enough to figure out what was happening. And Caro. Anthony Caro has decided that silence is his best option. He's preparing for a long conversation with federal prosecutors who specialize in making silence expensive." Character resolutions. Miss Channing arrived at 11:15, carrying the final legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who had survived a professional crisis, with her ethics intact. She settled into the red leather chair with visible relief. "The Thorne estate has been settled," she reported, producing a check that would keep Fritz's kitchen well stocked and Wolfe's orchids properly tended for some time, along with this letter from the executor. The letter was brief but eloquent. "Mr. Wolfe, if you're reading this, then I was right about needing help and about your willingness to accept it on terms I could live with. If there is any residue of my reputation left when the magistrates finish, please encourage the foundation to spend it on books." Wolfe read it twice, then set it down with the care reserved for things that matter without being fragile. "Dr. Pell?" I asked. "Cooperating fully with federal oversight," Miss Channing replied. "The court will appoint a monitor, but her programs can continue. She's already returned 2 donations that came through shell accounts. She's been learning fast about the difference between anonymous generosity and criminal laundering." "And Mrs. Thorne?" A fleeting smile crossed Miss Channing's face. "She sent white dahlias to Lane's hospital room with a note that read, 'For the man who finally told the truth.' She's also establishing a scholarship fund in her ex-husband's name for students who demonstrate integrity in business ethics. She said it seemed like an appropriate memorial for a man who died because he refused to compromise his principles." The Button's final service. After Miss Channing departed, I performed the last official act of our investigation. The Button, having served as evidence, testimony, and symbol, was ready to join the other mementos in our safe. Tokens of cases solved and justice properly served. "Archie," Wolfe said as I prepared to open the safe, That small object has demonstrated something important about the nature of evidence. Physical proof is valuable, but understanding the significance of that proof requires intelligence, observation, and the willingness to follow logical conclusions wherever they lead. I placed the button beside other tokens from previous cases. A fountain pen that had revealed a forger's identity, a theater ticket that had exposed a murderer's alibi, a chess piece that had unlocked a criminal conspiracy. Each object had its own story, its own moment of revelation, its own contribution to the long conversation between human folly and human justice. "You know," I said, closing the safe, "if you keep collecting these, one day you can open a museum." He considered it with the gravity he applied to all theoretical propositions. "A museum of admonitions, entry fee payable in candor. Steep price for this town." "Not steep enough," he said, reaching for his book on orchid cultivation. The Ritual of Restoration. Fritz announced lunch at 1 o'clock with a kind of flourish that suggested he considered our successful conclusion worthy of celebration. The meal he had prepared was a masterpiece of comfort and artistry. Duck breast with cherry sauce, wild rice with toasted almonds, and vegetables that had been coaxed to perfection through patience and skill. The wine, a burgundy that had waited exactly long enough for this moment, complemented the food with a harmony that makes you understand why some people consider fine dining a form of worship. As we ate, the brownstone completed its return to natural equilibrium. The case files were properly organized and filed. The surveillance cars had vanished from West 35th Street. The sense of violation that had followed our uninvited visitor had been replaced by the satisfaction of security properly restored. Wolfe's philosophical conclusion. When the last of the cheese course had been cleared and coffee poured, Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers finding their familiar position on his belly. The day's events, now digested along with the exceptional meal, were ready for philosophical encapsulation. "Archie," he began, his voice carrying the weight of considered judgment, "it is a curious thing, the human appetite for acquisition. It begins innocently enough, with the desire for sustenance, comfort, security. But for some, it metastasizes, becoming a hunger that consumes not only resources, but integrity, honor, and ultimately life itself." He paused, swirling the last drops of coffee in his cup. Mr. Thorne, a man of considerable wealth, found his appetite for integrity undiminished by his possessions. Mr. Baird, a man of similar opportunities, discovered that his appetite for illicit gain was insatiable. The irony is that Baird's scheme, had it succeeded, would have provided him with more than he could reasonably consume, yet he risked everything and took a life to obtain it. "He was protecting his investment," I offered. "He was protecting his greed," Wolfe corrected. The button, a trivial object in itself, became a monument to that greed. It was a detail, overlooked by carelessness, that unraveled a tapestry of corruption. It is always the details, is it not? The small, inconsequential things that betray the grand designs of men who believe themselves too clever for justice. The eternal appetite. I set down my coffee cup, reflecting on the enduring truth of his observation. "Well," I said, "at least our appetite for justice and for Fritz's cooking seems to be a healthier kind of hunger, and considerably less likely to land us in the federal penitentiary." Wolfe made a sound that could have been agreement or dismissal. He reached for the evening paper, already turning to the financial pages, perhaps to see if any other appetites were making headlines that might require our attention. The sanctuary restored. As evening settled over West 35th Street, the brownstone achieved its perfect state of ordered tranquility. Fritz moved through his kitchen with renewed contentment. The orchids continued their patient growth in the plant rooms above, and the city beyond our windows pursued its endless dance of ambition and consequence. The case was closed, justice had been served, and Nero Wolfe's appetite for truth had been properly satisfied. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges the city might offer, but tonight was for reflection, satisfaction, and the quiet pleasure of a mystery properly solved. Outside, the city continued its eternal churn, promising new ambitions, new deceptions, and inevitably, new buttons waiting to tell their tales. But inside the brownstone, all was as it should be. The appetite for justice had been fed, the sanctuary had been restored, and the small dark token that had started our investigation now rested peacefully among its companions, having done its work and earned its rest. In the world of Nero Wolfe, such satisfaction was both temporary and eternal. There would always be another mystery, but there would also always be the tools and temperament necessary to solve it. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the solution would be as simple as a button that had wandered too far from home and learned to speak the truth. That understanding, like Fritz's cooking, was best savored slowly and with proper appreciation for the craftsmanship involved.